Nile Gardiner from the Heritage Foundation is with me right here in the studio, and national security analyst Samantha Vinograd, she's at CNN New York. Nile, I want to start with you. Donald Trump wanted NATO countries to spend more on their defense so that the U.S. could spend less. To an extent, this has begun to happen. Is this the win? Is this what Trump was looking for as far as his NATO policy?
Well, I think we've certainly seen tremendous progress over the course of the last 3 years. And in fact, overall defense spending among NATO allies will be up by over $100 billion by the end of 2020. So that's significant progress for an alliance that has been resisting in the past spending additional amounts of money on defense. So we have seen most NATO members actually increasing defense spending, but still a lot more needs to be done. But I would say that NATO is actually stronger today than it was 3 years ago. And President Trump's sort of no-nonsense, very tough approach with regard to NATO has reaped dividends. And we have seen, I think, an alliance that is significantly stronger today than it was before.
Well, that's really interesting, because the storyline with Trump and NATO has been that this U.S. president has undermined NATO since he's come into power.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly been, I think, the line that his critics have taken. But the reality is very, very different. There are more U.S. troops on the ground in Europe today than there were 3 years ago. Almost every single NATO member is now spending more on defense. We have an alliance that I think is more effective.
By the way, they had pledged to do this before Trump came into office.
Well, they had certainly pledged to do so, but we're seeing the results today.
Yeah. Okay.
And you have seen many U.S. presidents appealing for increased defense spending, but with little to show for. But I think with President Trump, he has actually thrown down the gauntlet to all of the NATO alliance. And you have seen, I think, some significant results. And Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, has actually been effusive in his praise, actually, of Trump's leadership, U.S. leadership, actually, of the NATO alliance. And I think that the Secretary General of NATO knows what he's talking about, and he has pointed out the fact that U.S. leadership is very strong and robust with regard to NATO today, and that's a very good thing. U.S. leadership is absolutely vital on the world stage.
Let me turn to Samantha Vinograd in New York. Sam, Trump came down hard on traditional NATO allies of the U.S., and he got a lot of criticism for it. His critics said he was bullying U.S. allies. Now he's claiming victory, though. He tweeted this: "In the 3 decades before my election, NATO spending declined by 2/3, and only 3 other NATO members were meeting their financial obligations. Since I took office, the number of NATO allies fulfilling their obligations more than doubled, and NATO spending increased by $130 billion. Now, I want your perspective on this, because you worked in Obama's National Security Council, the early Obama years. Does it make you feel that sometimes, if you're the U.S., you can and have to push people around, including your allies, and that just asking politely won't get the job done?"
Well, I think it depends how you ask and what you're asking for, Cyril. From President Trump's perspective, bullying has benefits. He is touting the fact that other allies NATO allies have increased defense spending by 4.6% this year. 9 NATO members now meet the 2% commitment, 2% of GDP on defense spending, and he views that as a positive. But rather than doing this bullying in front of the cameras, President Trump should have asked these allies to increase their defense spending behind closed doors. That's point number one.
Would it have worked? Would he have got the same results, Sam?
He might have, and he would not have had the impact of showing internal division so publicly. Doing so and bullying our allies in front of the TV cameras only helps one person, really, right? It's Vladimir Putin, when he is pushing around Angela Merkel, Macron, and other smaller countries for not meeting their commitments publicly. That benefits our enemies, because he does not back that up publicly with a strong message of unity. And also, Cyril, what does he want allies to spend this money for? It is deeply important that allies might meet their commitments. Full stop. I agree with the president on that. But have we yet heard President Trump articulate the biggest threat to NATO members, which is Russia, and Russia's expanding influence and increased aggression? So it's important that he got our allies to a place where they spent more. But as he continues to really push Russian talking points, spread divisions, and bully our allies publicly, he is adding to the threats facing NATO and not articulating again what this money is actually for.
Sam, it's a big impeachment week, obviously, for the U.S. president. Is his power, in your opinion, diminished on the NATO stage because of what's happening in the U.S.?
I mean, Cyril, logical question. If you were a Democratic leader right now, would you feel as comfortable working with President Trump? It is a fact that President Trump has spoken privately and publicly.
He doesn't seem to be bothered by discomfort, though.
No, but you asked me I believe you asked me how this would impact his interactions with other leaders. From their perspective, we know what President Trump is going to do. President Trump is going to go on the international stage, insult Democrats, insult the impeachment inquiry, and insult anybody else who he doesn't agree with. But from other leaders' perspective, I look at this from the macro national security angle. If you're a Democratic leader from a foreign country right now, I would imagine you have deep concerns about the President of the United States publicly calling for another country, Ukraine, to investigate his political rival. I think that just logically will lead other leaders to take a step back from the president because they're so concerned about his misuse or abuse of power in the United States.
Nile, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, said recently to much fanfare that NATO was brain dead. Do you think NATO needs to rethink itself? Do you think it's brain dead? And if so, how does it reinvent itself?
Well, firstly, I would say that NATO is not brain dead. I think NATO is in very good shape. And secondly, I'd say that President Trump's approach is not bullying. He's forcefully leading on the world stage, which is what you expect from a U.S.
Semantics,
you expect a U.S. president to lead, and I think President Trump has definitely done that.
I would remind you, last time he went to, I believe, no, it was not a NATO meeting, but he has quasi-insulted NATO partners.
Well,
I don't know if that's leading.
I think that the president has basically made it clear to NATO partners that they need to step up to the plate. They need to invest more in the common defense of all 29 NATO member states. The United States spends 3.42% of GDP on defense. Other countries should also reach that same kind of level, or at the very minimum, 2% of GDP.
Sam's argument that spend more for what? He hasn't articulated a clear vision of what NATO is for and what it should do.
Well, one thing the Russians fear is a strong NATO alliance. And increased defense spending translates into a stronger NATO. That is absolutely clear. It means more troops on the ground. And you're actually seeing more U.S. forces on the ground in Europe today standing up to the Russian threat. And Vladimir Putin, I don't think, fears Emmanuel Macron or his grand European Union army, which is yet to materialize. But he does fear U.S. leadership on the world stage. And I think, yes, the president has stood up to the Russians significantly, and that is reflected by very strong U.S. policy on the ground in Europe, standing up to the Russian threat to the Baltic states, reinforcing the U.S. military presence in Eastern and Central Europe.
More often than not, he was forced to do so by his own Congress.
Well, I think that the president has led on these issues. You see U.S. policy in place that is very strong and robust. I would argue it's significantly stronger than it was under President Obama, who actually pulled some U.S. forces out of Europe, whereas Trump has increased the number of U.S. forces in Europe, and he's also increased U.S. defense spending. So that sends a very clear message to the Russians. We have to stand up to the Russians. If you want a real bully on the world stage, it's represented by Vladimir Putin. We need to stand up to bullies like Putin.
Nile Gardiner, thank you so much for joining us at this late hour
it's my
in
pleasure.
The studio here in London.